When we look upon the solemn portraits of medieval clergy, we see them as pillars of faith and spiritual authority. But what if behind those elaborate vestments and stern expressions lies a secret far more unsettling than we've been taught to imagine? There's a hypothesis so bold it challenges everything we think we know. What if some of these figures weren't human at all, but entirely different beings merely disguised in human form? For those unfamiliar with this concept, it's worth recalling a disturbing image captured by Michelangelo. A headless medieval knight from whose armor emerges something resembling a giant serpentine form. This image inevitably raises a question. What if similar entities were concealed inside the richly decorated robes of bishops? This suggestion might sound absurd. But don't dismiss it too quickly. We're about to embark on an unusual journey through the galleries of the past, where every painting becomes a potential clue. Our goal is to uncover details that could not just surprise us, but completely overturn our understanding of long-vanished eras, their technologies, and perhaps the very nature of power itself. Our investigation begins with the most obvious yet strangest detail in portraits of these clerics: their faces. A careful examination of numerous paintings created across different centuries and countries reveals the same recurring anomaly. The subjects either have no ears at all, or that part of their head is always meticulously concealed, sometimes by voluminous hair, sometimes by portions of a headdress or high collar, but the result remains constant. An anatomical feature common to every human is hidden from the viewer's sight. This cannot be mere coincidence or artistic whim. Rather, it suggests systematic concealment of something significant. If this were an isolated case, we could dismiss it as the artist's personal style. But when the same detail repeats across dozens of canvases, it transforms from random chance into pattern. A disturbing hint. The gaze of these figures often appears lifeless, frozen, devoid of all emotion. The eyes, supposedly the mirror of the soul, are empty and cold, looking straight through the viewer, creating an oppressive sensation. The faces themselves give the impression of being artificial, like skillfully crafted masks stretched over a completely different, non-human form. The skin appears too smooth, the features too idealized, or conversely, strangely disproportionate. You get the grim feeling of looking not at a portrait of a living person, but at an image of a mannequin or statue. This raises a logical question. If this is indeed a mask, what is it concealing? Why go to such lengths? What kind of being could be hidden beneath this facade? A being whose true nature had to be so carefully hidden from its flock and from posterity. The search for answers leads us from the face downward to the hands of these mysterious beings. Here we find a new, equally astonishing discovery that only strengthens our initial suspicions. The hands shown making gestures of blessing or holding sacred objects are not actually human hands. Their skin is unnaturally smooth, without a single wrinkle, vein, or pore. The reason is simple. It's not skin, but gloves. They have no nails, no cuticles, no other minute signs of living flesh that would identify them as human. They look like a perfect seamless shell. Again, a legitimate question emerges. Are these gloves worn on human hands, or is there something else hidden underneath? This detail fundamentally changes our perception. A mask hides the face and gloves conceal the limbs. We're presented with an image of complete, all-encompassing camouflage, hiding the true form of the creature from head to toe. But the most interesting part isn't the gloves themselves, but what's on them. On the fingers of these gloves, one can often notice strange rings that don't look like ordinary jewelry. They seem to be an integral part of the glove itself, as if sewn into it or serving as a functional component. These rings have unusual shapes, sometimes with slits, and are more reminiscent of parts of some mechanism than of decoration. Their appearance brings to mind toroidal transformers or other technical components. This is no longer just disguise. This is disguise with an unknown function. The gloves and rings cease to be merely part of attire and begin to look like elements of a complex device. This insight opens up a completely new direction for our research and makes us wonder, could their other attributes of power, such as their mysterious staffs, also have been not symbols but high-tech instruments? So, we've established that beneath the guise of saints, there could have been certain beings dressed in complete camouflage of masks and gloves. But the most interesting part lies in the details that transform this disguise into something more. On the fingers of these gloves, we often see strange rings that don't resemble ordinary jewelry. They appear to be integral parts of the glove itself, as if sewn into it or serving as functional components. Their structure, often with distinctive slits and coils, bears striking resemblance to what modern engineers would call toroidal transformers. This is no longer just jewelry displaying status. It's an element with potential technical purpose. If we assume these were indeed some kind of devices, their integration into the glove suggests the need for direct contact with or control over some form of energy. In that case, the gloves aren't just disguise but also an interface, a tool for interacting with power unknown to us. But these curious rings are just one piece of a vast technological puzzle. Our attention now turns to another far more prominent and significant attribute they constantly hold in their hands: their staffs. At first glance, it's a common symbol of clerical authority, a pastoral staff. However, here too, medieval artists have left us astonishing clues. In many paintings, these staffs are depicted as transparent, made of material resembling glass or crystal. Furthermore, around these transparent rods, one can often see something resembling a wrapping of wire or thin ribbon. This detail completely contradicts the traditional idea of a staff as a simple stick of wood or metal. Why the transparency? And what is this strange wrapping? All of this suggests we're looking not at a symbol, but at a complex technical device. The most astounding part is that this hypothesis goes beyond mere analysis of paintings. In a European museum, there exists a real artifact, a staff that looks exactly as it was depicted on canvases. It is indeed made of transparent material, confirming that artists weren't inventing this detail, but painting it from life. The existence of such an object moves our theory from the realm of speculation into the sphere of physical evidence. What if these staffs were some kind of energy devices or communication tools, a sort of ancient equivalent of smartphones, allowing long-distance communication or perhaps tools for manipulating energy? The transparent body could have been used for visual monitoring of some internal processes, while the wrapping could have been part of an electrical circuit, an induction coil in the hands of these beings. We no longer see mere symbols of faith, but real technologies surpassing anything we're accustomed to associating with the Middle Ages. Thus, the picture becomes clearer and simultaneously more fantastic. We see strange suits that could be protective gear. We see gloves with integrated technical components resembling transformers. We see complex instruments in the form of transparent staffs. All these elements combine into a single system designed to work with some powerful force. But what was it all for? What kind of environment required such complex and unusual equipment? What invisible but powerful force did they need protection from? And most importantly, what energy did they use and for what purposes? The answer to this question may be hidden in the most unexpected place, in the architecture and purpose of the ancient temples themselves. Strange suits, gloves with incomprehensible devices, complex instruments in the form of transparent staffs. All these elements seem like scattered pieces of one large puzzle. To assemble them, we need to answer the main question. In what kind of environment would such specific equipment be necessary? The answer might be as shocking as it is logical. It lies not with the beings themselves, but in the place where they operated. The ancient temples. There's a theory that these majestic structures weren't just houses of worship. Their architecture, tall spires, domes, an abundance of metal elements, along with precise alignment with cardinal directions, could have served an entirely different utilitarian purpose. The temples could have been gigantic installations, a kind of power plant designed to collect and accumulate powerful free energy, atmospheric electricity. These structures, like giant antennas reaching for the sky, could have captured the potential difference between the Earth and the ionosphere, concentrating colossal energy within their walls. If we accept this hypothesis, all the strange attire of the clergy instantly acquires a frightening but crystal clear meaning. To safely exist and work in such a place, at the epicenter of a high-intensity electric field, one would need not just clothing, but a full protective suit. High-tech equipment thought out to the smallest detail, and the traditional ecclesiastical vestments fit this description perfectly. Let's break them down layer by layer, like instructions for an electrician's suit. The long undergarment, usually made of linen, acted as the main insulator, a dielectric layer separating the body from the outer conductive layers. This is a basic Principle of electrical safety. Over this insulator, the outer garments were worn, tunics and robes richly embroidered with gold and silver threads. Gold is one of the best electrical conductors. Thus, all these golden ornaments and patterns weren't just displays of wealth, but the creation of a continuous conductive mesh on the surface of the suit. The culmination of this protective system is its conformity to a principle known in modern physics as a Faraday cage, or Maxwell cage. A massive polished gold plate on the headdress, the diadem, served as the upper contact of this cage. Together with the metallized clothing, it created a closed, conductive cocoon around the person. Any external electrical charge would flow along this conductive surface without affecting the person inside. A person in such attire could safely exist in an environment that would be fatal to anyone unprepared. Even a detail like the golden bells on the hem of the robe finds a technical explanation. It wasn't a musical instrument, but a kind of sound alarm, a primitive sensor. Upon entering a zone with high electrical potential, static electricity would cause the bells to ring or vibrate, warning the wearer of their approach to a dangerous field. Now it becomes perfectly clear why these beings had masks and gloves. These were the missing elements of the protective suit, completely isolating the body from the external environment. The mysterious electrical device staffs and transformer rings on the gloves are transformed from symbols into working tools. They were devices for interacting with the collected energy, for directing and using it. The mystery of their strange appearance is solved. It wasn't whim, but functional necessity, a condition for survival and work in a world of high energies. But this solution to one mystery gives rise to the next, even larger one. If they learned to collect and safely control such colossal power, what was this energy capable of? What tasks did they solve with its help? And how were these actions perceived by ordinary people who had no idea about the laws of physics? Now that we've imagined temples as giant power plants and clergy as operators in high-tech protective suits, we arrive at the climax of our investigation. By connecting all the previous parts, we can propose a hypothesis that redefines the very essence of religious miracles. If these mysterious beings had colossal controllable energy and advanced technologies at their disposal, then perhaps everything that has been considered divine intervention for centuries was nothing more than a demonstration of this technology to the uninitiated. All the miracles were simply the workings of their equipment, the laws of physics that the common people of that time mistook for manifestation of supernatural power. Let's consider the most famous examples. We'll start with the most common attribute of holiness, the halo. The shining aura around a saint's head, which we see in thousands of icons, paintings, finds a simple and logical explanation in the context of electromagnetism. In an environment with high-intensity electric field, the air around conductive objects begins to ionize, creating visible glow known as corona discharge. A person's head, especially when wearing a metal headdress or diadem, which we've already identified as part of a Maxwell cage, would be the perfect place for such an effect to occur. To an unprepared observer unfamiliar with physics, this glow would be undeniable proof of divinity. The same explanation applies to another phenomenon often described in the lives of saints: hair standing on end. This is a classic result of a strong electrostatic field. What is a simple school experiment for us was a sign of higher power's presence for a medieval person. Let's move on to the miracle of communication with the higher world. Recall the tradition. Icons and temples are often placed where a vision of a saint or some other apparition occurred. But what if cause and effect are reversed here? What if the icon is not a monument at the site of the vision, but the very device through which the vision was transmitted? In our technological paradigm, icons, especially those richly decorated with metal and crystals, could have been a kind of screen receiver for video communication. The appearance of a saint was, in essence, a communication session with gods or operators located elsewhere. This idea no longer seems so fantastic if we recall sacred texts. Remember how Noah received extremely precise engineering-level instructions for building the ark? Dimensions, materials, techniques. This sounds less like mystical revelation and more like receiving a technical specification via a communication device, a kind of ancient radio. But the technology wasn't limited to light and communication. It could also control matter. Consider the phenomenon of levitation. Many Catholic cathedrals have high pulpits and tribunes from which the priest addresses his congregation. The very architecture of these cathedrals, with their huge vaults and perfect acoustics, makes them giant resonators. In modern science, there's the concept of acoustic levitation, where powerful focused sound waves of certain frequencies can make objects float in the air. Imagine for a moment you are an ordinary person of that era. Knowing nothing about technology, you stand in a huge echoing hall, and suddenly the priest speaking from the pulpit begins to slowly rise into the air, accompanied by the powerful vibrating sounds of an organ or choir. Of course, you would believe you were witnessing a deity or his messenger. What might have been the work of an acoustic installation was perceived as an absolute miracle. Finally, the most daring assumptions concern travel through space. In some old engravings, one can see strange images resembling rainbows or beams of light emanating from flying objects or connecting different cities. In a religious context, this is interpreted as divine radiance. But in a technological one, it looks like the visualization of portals or transport corridors. If temples were energy hubs, it's logical to assume there was some system of communication and transportation between them. Perhaps these beams were a kind of tunnel for teleportation, allowing instant travel from one energy center to another. Thus we see that almost all key religious miracles, divine light, communication with the heavens, levitation, and instant travel, can be explained from the perspective of high technologies based on energy manipulation. The worldview where priests were engineers and temples were power plants appears coherent and logical. But if all of this existed, where did it go? Why do we now see only rituals, blind repetition of actions whose meaning has long been lost? Why have only empty symbols and dogmas remained from these great technologies? The answer to the question of where these technologies disappeared and why today we only observe solemn rituals devoid of physical power lies in the realm of social psychology and anthropology. The key to this puzzle is a phenomenon known to science as cargo cult. This term emerged in the mid-20th century when Pacific Islanders encountering American military bases saw how white gods received goods, clothing, food, and equipment from the sky. When the military left, the Islanders, not understanding the principles of radio communication and aviation, began to build mock airplanes from straw and sticks, erect wooden towers with antennas made of bamboo, and march with sticks instead of rifles, hoping that these ritualistic actions would make the Iron Birds return and bring goods again. They copied the external form of actions without understanding their internal content and mechanism. Let's apply this analogy to our situation with ancient temples and high-tech priests. Imagine that at some point in the past, perhaps as a result of global catastrophe, war, or simply the departure of this highly advanced civilization, the gods or technical specialists abandoned their posts. The power plants shut down. The screens went dark. The hum of generators ceased. The remaining people, who may have been only maintenance staff or mere observers, found themselves in a world where the familiar miracles no longer worked. They remembered that a person in a golden suit performed certain movements, uttered specific sound formulas, and in response, lights would turn on, diseases would be healed, or the weather would change. In an attempt to bring back their lost prosperity, they began to replicate these actions. Thus began the global cargo cult that we today call traditional religion. Generation after generation, people meticulously copied the clothing and tools of those they considered gods. But they did so using the primitive materials available to them, having lost all understanding of their functionality. The complex, multi-layered, protective suit of an electrician turned into the heavy brocade-embroidered vestments of priests. The very real transformers and technical connectors that were on the real devices became meaningless but beautiful golden patterns and patches that we see on clerical robes today. Functional elements became decoration. Transparent staffs with induction coils used to control energy were replaced by wooden or metal rods adorned with precious stones. Outwardly, they resembled the originals, but inside they were empty and technically useless. The same thing happened with headwear. The Maxwell cage and complex communication helmets, which concealed the absence of human ears or protected hearing from noise, transformed into mitres and croziers. The fabric lappets hanging from the headdresses of modern bishops are a vestige, an echo of the headphones or insulating elements that once had practical purpose. Now, they're just strips of cloth whose meaning even the wearers of these traditions cannot clearly explain. The rituals are also preserved operating instructions. The burning of incense could have originally been a disinfection procedure or a way to create a specific gaseous medium necessary for conductivity or for visualizing beams of energy. Chanting and bell ringing were attempts to recreate the very acoustic resonances that initiated levitation or open communication channels. But without proper equipment and precise knowledge of frequencies, it all turned into mere music and aromatic ceremonies. The period of the 15th to 16th centuries, to which many of the paintings we've examined belong, was likely the time when this cargo cult was finally canonized. It was then, on the ruins of forgotten technologies, that the visual and ceremonial style that has survived almost unchanged to this day was formed. The artists of that time might have still seen remnants of the real devices or their depictions on older artifacts, which is why their canvases show strange hybrids. Technology that no longer works but has not yet been fully stylized into a magical object. They were capturing the moment of transition from engineering to mythology. Ecclesiastical paraphernalia therefore appears before us as a giant museum of non-working technical mock-ups. Golden plates, chalices, complex candelabras. All of these could be copies of capacitors, resonators, and control panels. For centuries, people have polished these objects, treating them with awe and fear, believing in their sacred power, while in reality, they're worshipping cargo goods whose meaning has long been lost. The concept of sacredness, the idea of not touching the holy object, might have originally been a simple safety precaution. Don't touch high voltage. It will harm you. Over time, the warning about danger transformed into religious prohibition, and the high voltage zone became an altar, accessible only to initiates in protective suits. In this light, our entire history and culture demand radical reassessment. What we're accustomed to considering an ancient spiritual tradition may turn out to be nothing more than a grand millennial imitation of a great technological past. We're living in the shadow of giants whose tools we've turned into idols and whose operating manuals we've turned into prayers. This realization may be painful, but it opens up a fascinating prospect. Perhaps somewhere within these rituals and mock-ups, real knowledge is still encoded, waiting for someone who can look at them not with the eyes of a believer, but with the perspective of an engineer and researcher. And then magic will once again become technology. The cargo cult will give way to true understanding of our past. We conclude our unusual journey, which began with a single yet persistent detail in old paintings, the absence of ears on high-ranking clergymen. This small anomaly was the first thread we pulled, unraveling a whole tangle of mysteries and speculations. From the strange, lifeless faces that resembled masks, we moved to the hands hidden in gloves, with no hint of nails. On these gloves, we discovered rings whose shape was reminiscent not of jewelry, but of technical components like toroidal transformers. This finding, in turn, made us look anew at their transparent staffs with mysterious wrappings, suggesting they were not symbols of faith, but complex instruments. To understand why such strange equipment might have been necessary, we proposed the theory that ancient temples were not just places of worship, but giant power plants harvesting atmospheric electricity. In this context, the lavish vestments instantly transformed into sophisticated protective suits operating on the principle of a Maxwell cage, where every element from the gold embroidery to the bells on the hem served a protective or signaling function. The existence of such colossal energy and technology allowed us to reinterpret the miracles themselves. Shining halos turned out to be corona discharges. Communication with the heavens was video conferencing via icon screens, and levitation and teleportation were the work of acoustic and transport systems. Finally, to explain why only rituals remain from all this grandeur today, we turn to the concept of cargo cult. According to this idea, after the engineer gods and their technologies disappeared, people began to blindly copy their actions and attributes without understanding their original purpose. Thus, protective suits became vestments, and control panels became sacred relics. However, having traveled this entire path, it's crucial to understand one thing. The picture presented here is not an assertion of absolute truth, but rather an intellectual exercise, a thought experiment. It's just one of many possible theories that explain historical inconsistencies. The main goal of this investigation is not to make you believe that medieval bishops were operators of power plants. The primary objective is to awaken the researcher within you, to teach you to ask uncomfortable questions and to look at familiar things from a new, unexpected angle. The official history we're taught is full of blank spots, omissions, and contradictions. It represents only one version of the past, the most convenient one for the present moment. But beneath the layer of accepted dogmas and interpretations lies a vast number of facts and artifacts that don't fit into this version. The task of a thinking person is not to accept ready-made answers on faith, but to notice these inconsistencies. Why are there no ears in the paintings? Why do ancient texts describe events that sound more like the workings of technology than magic? Why is the architecture of ancient structures often excessive for their stated functions? It's precisely such questions that drive true discovery. The information presented here is merely food for thought, a starting point for your own search. It should not be taken as final truth. On the contrary, question every statement. Look for counter-arguments. Seek confirmation in other sources. The real value is not in accepting this or any other alternative theory, but in developing a habit of critical thinking and independently analyzing information. The call remains the same. Be curious, but be rational. Our history is often surrounded by many mysteries, and we shouldn't dismiss them just because they don't fit into a school textbook. But at the same time, we shouldn't blindly rush into any theory, no matter how beautiful or coherent it seems. Check everything yourself. Compare facts. Learn to distinguish logical assumptions from outright fantasies. History is not a frozen monolith, but a living, constantly changing organism that we come to know with each new discovery. What else is hiding in plain sight, on the canvases of the great masters, in the pages of ancient books, or in the stones of ruined cities? What other artifacts are waiting not for an archaeologist, but for an engineer to reveal their true purpose? The answers to these questions may be closer than they seem. After all, the greatest story is the one you discover for yourself by asking the right questions and not being afraid to search for the answers wherever they may be hidden.